So, a lot of you may know me for my Xenoblade 1 video, the 4-hour Xenoblade Chronicles critique. So, I think it's safe to say I love Xenoblade, and so I have been playing too much of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. And I thought it was great, so great that I decided to make this, which is a quasi-podcast of sorts. It's an unscripted video because I was too impatient to finish my scripted video for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, as well as the work for the scripted video for Xenoblade Chronicles 3. And I know I could have waited, but I felt this was more exigent than waiting for a scripted video because my interpretation and takeaway from Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is not represented among the discourse that I have seen on YouTube, forums, and other social media sites. I'm sure it's out there, I don't doubt that. This is not an original opinion I'm going to spew to you, but I haven't seen enough discussion around my interpretation, so I thought this was kind of necessary to spark more discussion around my interpretation. A lot of you are probably asking, then what is my interpretation? And that is that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a critique of sequelization, and especially the sequelization of Xenoblade and previous Xeno games, by saying that the reuse of the perfect work motifs is unsustainable. It's not conducive to sustainable storytelling. I can't get into that too much without spoilers, so we're going to shelve that conversation, and you'll have to trust me that it's there, especially in the ending and the latter half of the game. Until that spoilery stuff, we'll talk about anything that's not spoilery, and you can leave the video when there's spoilers if you still haven't played. You're wondering who I am? I'm Cynical. I made that 4-hour Xenoblade video that I mentioned before. I've also been working on other long-form critiques of Metroid Dread, Nier Automata, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in the meantime that I've been quote-unquote gone. Before we move on, just remember to like and subscribe. I know I'm begging, everyone does it, so I feel fine doing it. If you're curious about those future critiques, remember to subscribe, and if you want more attention on this kind of stuff, make sure to like, leave a comment, or even share. That always helps out. But moving on to the non-spoilery discussion, I think the most succinct thing I can say about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is that it feels like the most expansive game I've ever played. And that's not to say that it is the biggest game I've ever played. There are much more expansive games that I've played, like MMOs, gacha games, open worlds. Basically any Bethesda RPG like Skyrim has more content than Xenoblade 3. But the feeling of an expansive world is difficult to capture. And I think Xenoblade 3 does that so well because it feels like a small chunk of a much larger world with a more storied history than we ever get to see. There are a lot of storylines and histories that we don't get to see unfold that could have been explored. And despite that, Aionios is still the most expansive setting that a Xenoblade game has had since probably Xenoblade Chronicles X. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Chief among them is actually the focus on side quests, though calling them that feels like a disservice. I've seen a lot of criticism thrown around that everything in a game, especially JRPGs, should be reserved for the main story and that the side content is superfluous or should not be required to experience a game fully. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that claim because if the side content is meant to be superfluous, it shouldn't be there in the first place. And I think Xenoblade 3's approach makes side content, in quotes, side content, far more salient than in most other games I've played. What that means is that to experience the full story of your party of 6 and the people of Aionios, there are hero quests, as they're called, that facilitate some of the more tertiary aspects of the story that could derail the main story or the main quest if they were all required. And Xenoblade 3 is quite deliberate on encouraging you to do the side content at your own pace, and even making that a canonical thought that the characters have about whether or not it's wise to go out and do something that's diverging from their ultimate goal. But I implore you to do the side content. Anytime you see any hero quest, please go do it. It is beyond worthwhile because not only do you get to witness unique cultures sprout within the numerous colonies of Aionios, you also get to witness some of the more succinct and memorable storytelling within Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Try to be vague with this example, but basically a side objective, a general side objective that the party has is liberating colonies, which isn't their main goal, and obviously they do liberate some colonies along the way. Those are required to finish the main story. But there are even more colonies that are not required, and you can entirely skip these. They have fully voiced cutscenes, entire story arcs, and they even interlink with other colonies' stories and cultures. It's a bit of a web of connections between the colonies and their characters. Hence probably why the affinity chart is back now. Frankly, calling some of these hero quests side content, or even some of the side quests side content, feels disingenuous because there are some rather poignant moments within these quests that I could never separate from my own experience with Xenoblade Chronicles 3. The liberation of colonies was one of my favorite aspects of Xenoblade 3, and I always looked forward to it, and there are plenty of surprises. There was a colony that I tried to liberate late game that I thought was going to be boring, standard affair, and turned out to be one of my favorite hero quests and one of my favorite colony story arcs. Which is another thing I appreciate about Xenoblade 3, is that the stories of the colonies are not stagnant, and there is real concrete change for both the characters and their attitudes, as well as what's actually happening in the colony. I think this is a huge step up from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2, and feels like if Garfont Village from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was the standard for every town. And what's even crazier is that there are more towns or colonies in this game than there were in either Xenoblade Chronicles 1 or 2, which frankly baffles me. The scale that Monolith Soft strive to achieve is unmatched, and every time I think that hardware and time constraints have been bended to match the vision of Monolith Soft, they always want something grander. I deeply admire that, but that is also the core problem of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Its full vision was not realized, but I can still envision what they wanted. It's so close to being the full experience that I think they envisioned. There are even glimpses of that visually within the art book, where there are areas which don't exactly reflect what's in the final game, and funnily enough, these are all endgame areas, and I think that is because there were limitations in time and maybe budget, but I don't know, this is Nintendo we're talking about. And those limitations, whatever they were, seem to have altered the original vision of what Monolith Soft wanted, or at least what its artists wanted from the world of Xenoblade 3. The earlier areas seem to be more accurate to their depictions in the art book, though this isn't always the case, and I'll stay vague so there's no spoilers in that front. But I'm deeply serious when I mean the quote-unquote side content is the main content, and ignoring that would be a disservice to playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3. And I'm not advocating, oh, you didn't really experience Xenoblade 3 if you didn't do the side quests, because that's not true. You did experience your own version of Xenoblade 3, but from my experience of Xenoblade 3, doing all the quests that are deemed side content or superfluous to the experience were essential to my own main quest, to my experience of Xenoblade 3. And it helps that the stories in these hero quests are some of my favorite in Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Another way that the story feels expansive is through its characters, especially the main party of 6 that include Noah, Mio, Lanz, Eunie, Sena, and Taion. These 6 party members have extensive histories and involvement within Aionios. Each of these 6 party members have their own histories and identities that they struggle with, and they have to change in order to move forward. Because, again, a lot of this game is about the future and what's more sustainable and conducive to a better future and what is not conducive to that. I can't speak too much on the characters and what makes them a smaller part of a greater world without spoiling too much, so all I'll say is they are incredible and the best Xenoblade party in any game. The localization is one aspect I also want to include here as an element which makes Aionios feel more expansive and vast than it actually is. For starters, the localization is quite accurate to the Japanese version, from my understanding. Sans a few confusing examples where maybe there was too much adherence to the Japanese version, that there was some miscommunication. I haven't personally confirmed these examples myself. I have seen them online, though I am playing through the game in Japanese right now, so I will be able to tell you about those examples later for the actual scripted video on Xenoblade Chronicles 3. But what the localization does best, and even the story as a whole, is having the characters talk like they live within Aionios. They are not willing to explain outright everything to a person who's confused or has amnesia. These characters use their vernacular and vocabulary like it's second nature, and they don't care to explain because the people they're communicating with know about that. I think an early example I loved was power frame. They throw that term around a bit for the Keves soldiers, and Lanz specifically talks with Riku about repairing a power frame, and Lanz specifically talks with Riku about maintaining and repairing his own power frame, and they don't stop to explain what the power frame is. I think you could obviously say that that's confusing, that they don't explain something, but I prefer this approach to world building because the characters talk as though these foreign words to us are natural to them. And what a power frame is, you can easily pick up throughout the game. It's the glowing circular technology that all Keves soldiers have around their combat uniforms. And that is confirmed later on when the party member remarks that Keves soldiers need their power frames to be stronger or at equal strength to an Agnian soldier. And the difference between their outfits is that all Keves soldiers have that circular glowing technology and the Agnians don't. And by deduction, you can figure out that those are the power frames. It's the circle things that look like what Shulk had in Future Connected. It's really clever. And that's just one example of many different foreign words you'll hear when playing this game. If you have the patience or the care to continue playing through the game and to continue exploring this world, you will have your answers. By they, I mean the answers are introduced in a way that feels as though characters are having a conversation and not introducing a mechanic or idea to the audience. I won't spoil all the instances of this, of the game being more implicit with its world building, but it's a feature of Xenoblade 3 specifically, which I greatly and deeply appreciate. If I have to voice some confusion around the localization as well as the story as a whole, is specifically at some of its vocabulary. Now, I'd say the story, the writers, and the localization team were certainly careful in the words they chose for the characters to use, and there aren't many inconsistencies in that regard. For instance, you will never catch a person in Aionios calling a colony anything other than a colony. A town? No. A village? No. They are always colonies. That consistency is wonderful, but there's one term where I'm still confused about its existence. The term I'm referring to is people, and people, as well as humankind, are words that are used to reference everyone who lives in Aionios. There are even some characters later on that I don't think should have used the word humans that do, and I'm still confused by that. Because there are characters like Noah, Lanz, and Eunie, who in Xenoblade 1 would have been called Hums, Machina, and Hyentia respectively. The use of humans or people as a catch-all term for anyone in Aionios engenders this world with its own unique culture. But I'm still curious about the implications of that, and I don't think those implications were properly or thoroughly explored. Again, that's echoing the idea that what we see of Aionios in Xenoblade 3 is just a small glimpse of a larger world. I think one of the last things I want to mention in this non-spoilery section, which contributes to the grandiosity of Aionios, is the fact that how the world is designed works differently. And frankly, I should have seen this coming with how they changed loading in Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. So, bit of a tangent. In Xenoblade 1 and the Definitive Edition on the Switch, how loading works is that when you go to a new area, the game loads in the entire zone. For example, when you go to Colony 9, it will load the entire Colony 9 area for about 10-ish seconds, from what I can recall from playing the game. And for the far-out objects, the game will just have 2D images and or low-poly objects or models, etc. But since those areas are in the game's memory, when you teleport from one landmark to another, it is almost instantaneous. In fact, I think the loading takes 2 to 3 seconds from landmark to landmark in the same area, and I thought that was a bit weird, especially with how lightning fast the loading was. I mean, I wasn't complaining. It was quite a convenient feature of Xenoblade Definitive Edition. It should have been a hint of what was to come in Xenoblade 3, because Xenoblade Chronicles 3 uses the same loading mechanics of Xenoblade Definitive Edition, where you only actually enter a real loading screen when you go from one region to another. But unlike Xenoblade Definitive Edition, there are far less regions and much more monolithic maps, because what would have been 2 different zones in Xenoblade 1 or 2 now comprise a third or half of one region in Xenoblade 3. In fact, I think the first region of Xenoblade 3 is comparable to 3 to 4 areas from Xenoblade 1 and 2, depending on how you divide it up. And that is quite impressive. I would never have expected that from a Xenoblade game, especially one on the Nintendo Switch, this little underpowered tablet. It's actually rather impressive. And I gush about the technology used to make Xenoblade 3 in the scripted video. I've written some of the sections for it. Not everything's perfect, obviously. Graphically, there's some low-resolution textures from time to time, especially when you get too close to some mountainsides. Some shadows are also quite low resolution, probably to save on processing power. But again, Monolith Soft has this recurring theme of uncompromising vision no matter the consequences. And I think even here, these vast regions are that monolithic vision, and the compromises are some low-resolution textures, or some low-resolution shadows, or the fact that the game doesn't even technically run in 720p, it's actually running in 540p, but there's some little clever anti-aliasing whenever a new model loads in. All of that feels like a recurring note in Monolith Soft's history as a developer. And with this trajectory of Xenoblade 3's scale increasing even with Xenoblade 2 being as huge as it is, I am excited for the future of Xenoblade. I am quite curious how the lofty visions of Monolith Soft will manifest in the future. I hope that convinces you enough to play the game if you haven't already. Please, it feels like a massive game. It is not, and you can tailor your experience to however you want to play. You can do as much or as little as you want. If you couldn't tell, I did everything in the game, but you don't have to do that to experience Xenoblade Chronicles 3. You can do the bare minimum, you can do everything, you can do somewhere in between. All of it is valid. For me personally, I think completing everything was the right choice, because now I can understand this world in its entirety, and I think it is beautiful. Alright, so now we'll talk about all the spoilery stuff, including what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which is Xenoblade 3's message and critique about sequelization. So if you haven't played the game, feel free to exit out. I'll give you all a few seconds to do that, so we'll just keep chatting for a little bit. You're doing okay. Go play Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I would absolutely recommend it. There will also be spoilers for Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2, so if you haven't finished all 3 games, I would recommend turning away, because Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2 are more essential to understanding the message of Xenoblade 3 than I think has been discussed online. And now that you all are gone, I hope, and I mean that in the most respectful way possible, we need to talk about the endless now and sustainable storytelling. So I mentioned the concept of sustainable storytelling at the very beginning of this video. What that means for Xenoblade 3 is that sustainable storytelling uses new ideas and new sights and sounds and new worlds and new characters to tell its own story. Now, how Xenoblade 3 discusses sustainable storytelling is by presenting a world which is unsustainable, that comprises reused landscapes and even music and even character arcs to criticize the reuse of past stories to essentially recreate the same feeling endlessly. And that is, in my opinion, what the Endless Now represents metaphorically. Because the Endless Now is the world of Aionios. And the world of Aionios was created because of collective fear. Fear of the unknown, of something new. And while in the story that is on the literal level represented by the merging of two worlds, on a metaphorical level, that can mean moving forward from the stories from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. And that commentary extends beyond Xenoblade 1 and 2, extends to Xenogears and Xenosaga, because Xenogears, for those who don't know, was the directorial debut of Tetsuya Takahashi, who is the executive director for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and the other Xenoblade games. And he also had directorial involvement in the creation of Xenosaga, another RPG series made by Monolith Soft. And Xenogears, after it released, received a companion piece called The Perfect Works, which is an outline, a rather detailed outline of the entire universe of Xenogears and what was planned. So Xenogears itself was a glimpse, a little dot on this timeline. It was supposed to be episode 5 of a 6-episode saga. And I don't use saga lightly. This really was meant to be an entire saga. And having left Square after that, along with his wife, Soraya Saga, who was essentially a co-creator of Xenogears with Takahashi, and still contributes to Xenoblade to this day. Having left Square, for the both of them, they both left Square after making Xenogears, they couldn't use that property anymore. So what they did, having adored the world they created, is they reused those stories. They said, if we can't tell the story we initially wanted with Xenogears, we'll do that with Xenosaga, and now Xenoblade. There are other videos out there discussing the similarities between Xenoblade and Perfect Works, so feel free to seek those out. This is not going to be that, but maybe I'll discuss that more in the Xenoblade 3 scripted video. But what's important is that the Perfect Works, or the universe of Xenogears, has been recycled twice now for Xenosaga and Xenoblade. It may be loosely, but it's still there. It's still looming in the background as this rule that Xenoblade must adhere to the Perfect Works. It must be like the Perfect Works. It must have elements from the Perfect Works. It must be like Xenogears. It must be like Xenosaga. It must reference Xenogears. It must reference Xenosaga. Or with Xenoblade 2, it has to play like the original. It can't be open world like X. And I think those constraints maybe frustrated Monolith Soft and manifested in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which we'll talk on the literal level for a moment, and then I'll explain how that's metaphorical for this desire to move on from the sights, sounds, and stories of Xenoblade 1 and 2. So, Aionios is the Endless Now, a creation of fear, and how the characters resolve that is by destroying that world. And what's in Aionios is the sights and sounds of Xenoblade 1 and 2. There is one area that is wholly unique in this entire game. The rest consists of amalgamated and transformed areas from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. Milik Meadows is a combination of the Fins of Uriah and the plains of the Bionis Leg. Alfeto Valley houses the remains of Melnath's shoulder, which is the shoulder of the Titan of Gormott. From the distance, you can even see Capricorn Peak makes the shape of the head of the Gormati Titan. Or look at the Urian Mountains for a more explicit example, where it is a frozen body of the Urian Titan with a massive hole in it. Or look at Mac the Wildwood, which has the trees of Magna Forest with the buildings from the ruins of Moratha. Or think of Erythia Sea with the islands of the Letherian archipelago conjoined with the endless sea of Aerith Sea, and as well as its boundaries, and Bionis' head sticking out near the end behind Agnus Castle. Or even the castles themselves, they are subversions of what was in Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. For instance, Keves Castle has the Ring of Alchemoth, and the rest resembles Hardhigh Palace from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in its aesthetic and architecture. And yet this is the place which houses the Queen of Keves, the nation based off the characters of Xenoblade Chronicles 1. And then you have Agnus Castle, which is white, the color of Alchemoth, and it shares a lot of similar architecture on the outside to Alchemoth from Xenoblade Chronicles 1, but it houses the Queen of Agnus, which is the nation that shares a lot of similarities to the world of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. There's a lot of mixing and meshing between worlds, and none of it is wholly original sans origin. But these unoriginal locations are the environment of the Endless Now, this place created by fear. That same idea extends to the music, because a lot of it is a fusion of melodies from 1 and 2. If you look at Great Cop Falls, it's a fusion of the melody from Magna Forest in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, and later on it includes the vocals of the Kingdom of Uriah from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Or you can look at one of my favorite examples, which is the Great Sword's Base, which is essentially redux of Sword Valley from Xenoblade Chronicles 1, except instead of being ominous, it's reassuring, calming. It's meant to mark a major accomplishment of the party for traversing the entirety of Aionios and making it to Swordmarch. There are a lot more examples I want to talk about in my scripted video, so I'll save them for that. But needless to say, the sights and sounds of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2 are the Endless Now. Those worlds, reusing those worlds, is a creation of fear, of not wanting to move forward with the future. And because it's the sights and sounds of past games in this series, I believe Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is criticizing the reuse or the recycling of worlds in storytelling, saying that reuse of worlds is a creation of fear. It is not a bold story then. And that's why I think, especially near the end, the characters are so focused on the future and how to help the future and how to move forward, because that is the whole point. And moving forward from the perfect worked story and the sights and sounds and worlds of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2 and now 3, that's all essential in sustainable storytelling, in moving forward from that. And it is just one extension of the late game motif of moving forward to the future, because that idea manifests in several aspects, but the most poignant one for me is critiquing sequelization and saying that it is a creation of fear, that reusing ideas does not make a bold story. I think it's actually really powerful stuff, but it's something I haven't seen discussed. It's mentioned in passing, but it's the point of the story, of the world, of why it's Aionios, of why there's the recycling of designs and locations and music from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2. That's the whole point of that. It's there for a purpose. It's not something that's lazy or something used to save time. It is quite purposeful in its messaging and symbolism for what the Endless Now represents. So now that I'm done gushing about that messaging near the end of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, one thing I want to take the time to mention is some of my confusion surrounding Xenoblade Chronicles 3, because I genuinely mean it when I say everything to make Xenoblade Chronicles 3 my favorite Xenoblade game is there. It exists in the game. It is just not structured properly for me to find appreciation, especially in the end game. For one, the thing I mentioned earlier of the characters who are spoilers that refer to Hums and Machina and Hyentia and Blades as humans, those are Melia and Nia. And Melia and Nia, I don't think, should refer to the people of Aionios as people, or there should have been something to justify that change in their language, because it is different than their original worlds. And their original worlds, or rather the memories of them, still exist inside their brains. They remember it clearly, they inform the party of it, and yet that essential vocabulary that would never have left them no longer exists. I think the only explanation for that would be the passage of time and assimilation to the culture of Aionios. Yet Melia was imprisoned for an indeterminate amount of time, and Nia was in cryosleep for an indeterminate amount of time. For Nia, there could be the excuse that while she was still active, she assimilated to the culture of Aionios. But for Melia, I don't understand how she assimilated. If it is forced upon Melia, how did that happen if she was imprisoned? I'm still confused about that, and I don't think there will be answers for it. But to return to my point about structure, there's spoilers for the post-game, so if you haven't booted up your file after beating the game, do so. You'll find 2 new heroes. Please go do those hero quests. The Nia hero quest, specifically the Ascension quest, has some vital information to make the ending poignant that is not there in anything else in the game. I have completed the entire game. As far as I can remember, there is no other information that explicitly states what will happen after the worlds merge, after defeating Zed, except for this. There are hints of it, but this line from Nia about the worlds will have to separate is the only thing that creates tension or conflict around the validity of confronting Zed, defeating them, and ending Aionios. And it's so relevant. It's what makes me appreciate the ending, because then I can appreciate that there is conflict in confronting Zed. Because even though Zed is a sadistic figure, all Mobius are sadistic, frankly, and that's showcased time and time again. And so I'm fine with their sadistic nature being so cartoonish, because that's a point. And so having conflicting feelings around defeating the maliciously sadistic person who is irredeemable, that's interesting to me. Because then the problem isn't an individual person, it's the system or the world itself. There's a conversation in Max the Wildwood between Nene and the rest of the party, which really fascinated me, and it made me curious to explore the rest of this world, because as non-academic, non-pedantic as it sounds, Nene says this point in a questioning manner. So world is supervillain pawn, and that point really blew me away, even as unpedantic as it sounds, because it's addressing the malice present within the systems of Aionios and how it's structured, other than using an individual like the Mobius as a scapegoat for all the problems of the world. Because the world itself is the problem, and fighting that systemic inequity is something I don't see brought up in other stories, especially high fantasy or science fiction stories. It's such a real conflict within our own world of trying to fight systemic inequities that exist already, and it feels natural to apply that to a fictional world. And when stories use individuals as scapegoats for the problems of the world, I usually roll my eyes, because it's harder to appreciate a story when that's not very realistic, because in reality, systems and how they're structured and how they've been structured are to blame, not individuals. There is no big, bad, evil emperor of something awful. There is none of that in the real world. And what's more real is saying that the system is not working, and we should change that. So seeing that, in maybe a not so elegant way of calling the world supervillain pawn, but saying that the system is supervillain pawn, that point is something crucial to understanding the problem of Aionios. And it's a shame personally that this line, the line with Nia about the world separating, that's another part of the world being supervillain pawn, because this world is made of fear, and no matter how much these people appreciate and enjoy and even love the other people they have found in Aionios, staying in this world, staying in this system will kill them. It already does, and the annihilation events reinforce that because the world is slowly dying. The annihilation events are slowly eating away at Aionios, and staying in that system would only lead to destruction. That is such a real and visceral, dare I say accurate, depiction of how fantasy world would function. But again, you can't do the Nia Ascension quest until after you beat the game, so that piece of the puzzle is missing. It's in the wrong place. It should have been before I fought Zed, because before then, I had no qualms fighting Zed. There's no problems with fighting Zed. But when you understand that Zed is representative of systemic inequity, and that taking that down will result in far deeper changes than expected, that's an interesting conflict. And ultimately, the game does conclude that that fight to take down the system of Aionios, no matter how painful, is worthwhile. And I agree with that conclusion, obviously, so that will obviously influence how I see this story. But it's an essential part of the conflict of confronting Zed that's absent. And there's a lot of those pieces. There's little pieces that are absent. And there's another one, the big Chapter 5/6 reveal that everyone talks about, the one where Mio and M switch bodies. I appreciated how defeated the party was, and how much they tried to break free but could not. The despair in that moment was palpable to me, and the switch of Mio and M and revealing that felt like a betrayal, because I was so shell-shocked that there were actual consequences in this game. And then Mio's still here. Our Mio. It wasn't M with Mio's memories, which would have been a cool twist, actually. I kind of like that. But it was just Mio. And it took me a while to accept and appreciate that, because now I think what's missing is one little piece of information that would have made me like this reveal on the first try. And that was, how did M know what N was going to do with the party? Because it's framed as though he all of a sudden comes up with this insanely sadistic idea to execute Mio, or to send her off in front of the people who care about her the most. It feels like something that's impromptu and impulsive. So how did M know about this? I think there should have been more clarification on that, because with that piece of information of how M could foresee this scenario, maybe M and N were talking about this, maybe this was N's plan all along, and there's some miscommunication on that front from the writers and storytellers. But adding that piece of the puzzle, if there is some way she knew, then I can deeply appreciate this change, because the consequence of Noah being defeated and wanting to embody the ideology of Mobius, that's still a real consequence. Something he had to change, even if Mio comes back. And the game clearly establishes throughout most of it that memories are more important than an actual life returning. Hence why I think the return of Moamba and Hacked is welcome, because they don't have their memories and they create new lives from their new bodies. Same with Hammurabi and Ethel. Their sacrifice, their choice of their lives still mattered, because what they do now is different. It is not the same person. They may look the same, they may act similarly, they are not the same person. It's why there's pushback against Ouroboros from people like Shania, because in a system which grants one life, one potential life, any harm or detriment that is out of a person's control cannot be changed. Any of that trauma cannot be changed. And Shania's genocidal tendencies were a bit far, and I wasn't entirely on board with that. But I think the conflict of her embodying this imposing philosophy to Ouroboros is quite interesting, because she wants a second chance even though the system was against her, which, returning to before, reinforces that the problem is Aionios itself and not the people. It is Aionios making these people do vile things that they do not have control over. And when they try to seek control and try to become a gold rank colony and free themselves from the fighting, they are killed by Mobius. It's brutal. And it's that realization, that thought process of world is supervillain pawn, as corny as it is, that is the key to helping me appreciate the ending of Xenoblade 3. I still have a lot of problems with it, and I think there's a lot more missing puzzle pieces that aren't present in the game, or maybe they will be in DLC, but in my brain, I can make those puzzle pieces. So I can envision best parts of Xenoblade 3. I can envision the perfect ending. The problem is it doesn't actually exist. And I think that is because Monolith Soft thought too far. They thought too big. Their dreams were too lofty. And that's why I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the confusion and different area looks and enemy similarities all happen near the end game. Because I think all the attention was given to all the earlier stuff, and then the later stuff, there had to be compromises. I don't think the anti-delay to July is the cause. Seriously, 3 months in the gaming world is nothing. There's nothing else they could have added in that 3 months. It just would have been 3 months of nothing. They would just be chilling, vibing. But if they received another year, or year and a half, or 2, I think those final areas and those final story beats could have received other drafts in the script beforehand, and more attention could have been placed on those elements, because I feel certain that this is the story Monolith Soft wanted to tell, but maybe not in their ideal vision. And, well, if that ain't the story of every single game, I don't know what it is. But that scope is my biggest problem with Xenoblade 3 after playing it. But it's also why I wanted to talk about the game, because its scope is so massive and it feels grander than anything I've ever played. Monolith Soft's dedication to making monolithic games is the company's greatest strength and its weakness. But I still love it anyway, because that vision, that dream of going big and trying to make your ideal vision no matter how large, I can't help but admire that. I think that's going to do it for this video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe again, and share this video around if you enjoyed it and want other people to see it. Especially in the comments, let me know if you liked this type of video, if you want more unscripted quasi-podcast episodes in the interim when I'm working on the more scripted content and constantly criticizing myself and not progressing as far as I want to. I think I'll just have to accept some things aren't going to be perfect and move forward with everything. Thank you all for the support in this past year. Oh my gosh, I've received so many great comments from you all. Thank you so much. Let me know if you want more quasi-podcast stuff. I can easily talk about that. I always try to play games about, 2 a month, I think is my goal. It was my goal this year. And so I can try to keep current with what's happening in the scene of video games. How's the art form evolving? What have I missed? Finishing my backlog, etc. So if you want me to talk about more of that, let me know. I'll have more quasi-podcast episodes in the interim. And they don't take away too much work from the scripted videos. So if you're worried about that, it'll be all good. Anyway, I've been Cynical. I hope you have a great day. See you next time.